Good morning. It's October 29th, 2024. We're critiquing the news. The article on your screen is from the Washington Post, and it's an opinion editorial by Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, titled "The Hard Truth: Americans Don't Trust the News Media." In fact, just yesterday I saw a chart which showed Americans' trust in media over time, and since 1950 it had fallen from about 65% from memory down to 31% today, and that 31% would be pretty much 100% Democrats. It's the Democrats, it's the left every time that believe in impossible things. So I'm sure Jeff won't mind in terms of copyright if we go through his op-ed in some detail. I mean, he's gone to the trouble of printing it, so I guess he wants it out there. In the annual public surveys about trust and reputation, journalists and the media have regularly fallen near the very bottom, often just above Congress. And that's true in Australia because our media were often regarded at about the same level as used car salesmen, whereas firefighters, ambulance officers and doctors were regarded as the most honourable and trustworthy professions, something we took great pride in the fire brigade. But in this year's Gallup poll, Jeff continues, we have managed to fall below Congress, and that's quite an achievement, to be actually less trustworthy than their globalist-owned government. He says, our profession is now the least trusted of all. And it's not really Jeff's profession, because Jeff's a mid-ranking globalist billionaire investor. His profession is, pretty much just making a lot of money or turning a lot of money into even more money and getting rid of small businesses with his major business, which is Amazon. It's really only his profession because he bought that company, the Washington Post, to use it as a megaphone. So it's not really even honourably acquired. It was bought by Jeff, I would imagine, on the advice of the globalists in order to achieve a globalist objective. But at least he admits that something that they're doing is clearly not working. He uses an analogy then about voting machines, and I'm pretty sure that most Americans now know that the voting machines were installed specifically to cheat in elections. And they look at the results coming in from places like Australia and France and Argentina and Venezuela even, where votes are counted manually in just a few hours and where the results are known pretty much straight up. And in most of those countries, well, not all of them, but most countries, you have teams from both camps, or both major camps and also the minor camps in the elections, standing there observing to make sure that the cheating doesn't occur, which is why in Australia the cheating's done behind the scenes, but that's a whole other topic. So Jeff is a little bit disappointed here. He says it's a bitter pill to swallow that people aren't believing the media any more than they believe in voting machines. So he says that anyone who doesn't see this is paying scant attention to reality, and those who fight reality lose. Reality is an undefeated champion. And indeed it is. But the left just continue to have this Quixote-esque battle. They continually tilt at windmills in order to defeat their imaginary monsters and wind up flat on their backs every single time, unfortunately often taking down a lot of innocent bystanders in that process. Now, Jeff says here, we must work harder to control what we can control to increase our credibility. And really the only way that they could do that would be by dismissing at least half their staff at the Washington Post, because if you understand how O'Sullivan's first law works, and O'Sullivan himself was a journalist, it's the first leftist to get to a position of hire and fire within an organisation will hire only leftists and fire only conservatives until you have organisations that are completely run by left-wingers. And the prime example of that in the media sphere is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, as it is now, who are 100% leftists. There's not a conservative left amongst them because of the effect of O'Sullivan's law over time. And of course, it's always been an ambition of the Gramscian left to do their long march through the institutions to overturn the West with ballots rather than bullets. Big part of that was getting control of the media, which is why globalists like Bezos buy organisations like the Washington Post in order to use them as megaphones. Of course, they can appeal to the former authority of the Washington Post back when it was a respectable organisation. They effectively wear its past credibility as a skin suit, as a disguise, while they wage their war against America. So this op-ed is written seemingly as a response to the reaction from the Washington Post staff when Bezos vetoed backing Harris for this presidential election. And he goes to some length here to say how presidential endorsements do nothing to tip the scales. They just out the organisation as partisan, and that's exactly what they do. We see it with our ABC all the time. They're always very pro-Elbow and anti-Dutton, because being leftists, they don't seem to understand that both parties are now controlled by the globalists. Or if they do know that at the more senior levels in that organisation, then it's probably because that they don't want to let the cat out of the bag to the mainstream normie Australian population, that they are in fact one organisation pretending to be two, that we have an illusion of choice when we vote here in Australia. Same as the Americans were getting to with so many rhinos in their Republican Party, Republicans in name only. But, the emergence of Trump and the MAGA Republicans split the Republicans into two. Still the majority of Congress critters in the Republican Party are rhinos. With luck, the GOP, Grand Old Party, has managed to get rid of a lot of those under the co-chairmanship of Laura Trump, Trump's daughter-in-law. And if that's the case, then there may be some hope of getting some balance back into US politics and not have it their illusion of choice, single-party strategy that we have here. Now, Bezos goes on about the perception of having been got to by the Trump campaign. He denies that, of course. I think it's more likely that he's seen the writing on the wall, that unless he tries to restore some semblance of credibility to the Washington Post, that it's just going to go bankrupt, and he will then not have a megaphone to use. It's not the money matters to Bezos. He's got to prop it up so that he can keep using it to shout his left-wing propaganda, his globalist messaging at the American people. Now, he goes on to talk at some length about maybe he hasn't influenced the Washington Post in the time that he's owned it, which is going on 11 years now. He claims that, there's all this editorial independence and balance and whatever else, and it simply doesn't exist. Leftists have a hive mind. They seem to know pretty much automatically what each other expect, and they would know that when someone like Bezos buys an organisation such as the one they work for, that they've got to toe a certain line, that they've got to produce content that meets certain criteria, which is exactly what they've done. Bezos actually says here, lack of credibility isn't unique to the Post. Our brethren newspapers have the same issue, and not just newspapers, it's the TV stations, the cable outlets, and a lot of the radio stations as well. There's still some AM broadcasters that allow both sides of the story to get out there. So if you're an American, or if you're in America and you come across an AM station in particular that's broadcasting Alex Jones, then you'll know that they're able to provide both sides of the argument. But if people like Jones, or to a lesser extent Joe Rogan or Tim Pool, aren't having their material repeated there either as news or as podcasts or broadcasts, then they're probably owned by the left-wing liberal hive mind. And now, later in the op-ed here, Bezos goes off to rail a bit at emergent media, on alternative media. So he describes those as off-the-cuff podcasts, inaccurate social media posts, which means basically information on social media platforms that he doesn't agree with, and other unverified news sources, which verification is just the appeal to authority, logical fallacy. People that want to claim that their news is verified based on the reputation of their organisation, when in fact that news is made up, usually by a Democrat activist, and is getting a glossy coat of credibility from the fact that it's being reported by these legacy media organisations that once had these great reputations, doesn't make it any less fake. He says the Washington Post and the New York Times win prizes, but increasingly we talk only to a certain elite. And it's the certain elite that they're talking to that issue the prizes. These days, if you've got a Nobel Prize, it just means that you're woke. It doesn't mean that you're any good at what you do. We've even got cases recently where a Nobel Prize was awarded fairly to a physicist. I believe from memory his name was Clausen, who is absolutely accurate, but people disregard what he says because he's got a Nobel. It'd just be easier if they hadn't given him the Nobel, so that he could still have had more credibility amongst climate realists. So he's bemoaning the fact that people are rejecting his media organisation, and complaining that in the 1990s they achieved 80% household penetration in the DC metro area. DC is called the swamp not only because it's low-lying, but because that is the area where the swamp creatures go to grift off the American public, and this is why Trump said he wanted to drain it. So pretty much everyone that lives in the DC metro area, in that square mile, are leftists, and they're working against the interests of the US, whether they know it or not, and by extension the interests of people of the free world, whether they know it or not. So Bezos continues here, while I do not and will not push my personal interest, yeah right mate, I will also not allow this paper to stay on autopilot and fade into irrelevance. It's not on autopilot, Jeff. It's being driven by globalists, and they're driving into irrelevance with endless fake news, endless clashes with reality that everyone who lives in the real world can see. It's only the left-wing self-described elite in the Washington DC swamp that believe otherwise these days, and that's only because it's a necessary self-delusion so they can sleep at night. So he says here that he's worried about being overtaken by unresearched podcasts and social media barbs. If by unresearched podcasts he's talking about things like the conversation, the 3-hour unscripted conversation between Joe Rogan and Donald Trump the other day, which, by the way, if you want to watch it on YouTube, you've actually got to go to Joe Rogan's channel and scroll through it to find it. It's unable to be found on YouTube using the regular search references that you would use in any other search engine, because YouTube has used its algorithms to try and make it disappear. But if you look at that, it's not unresearched. It's a matter of two individuals having a conversation and revealing a whole lot of information in that process, and one of them happens to be a candidate for the President of the United States. So, Bezos can try and trash that as much as he likes. It's not going to make any difference, because people are going to see that and they're going to recognise truth. They're going to recognise the reality there. And social media barbs, I think what he's talking about there are memes, and memes are a way of humorously delivering information to people that may not necessarily be looking for that information, who may not necessarily want to even consider, or who haven't considered that information. So with a picture and just a handful of words, you can get through to people and help them understand the lies that we're being told in 1,000 and 10,000 word essays on the Washington Post and other respectable platforms. So anyway, it's Bezos continues here, the stakes are too high, and indeed they are. They're very high. The globalists have got everything resting on the outcome of this election, and this is why I expect things to get very interesting. That's why I'm amazed there hasn't been an October surprise so far, other than rehashing the same tired old things that they're always throwing at Trump. Trump is Hitler. Trump touched my bottom in 1962. Trump's said something nasty. Well, nobody cares. Even if those things were true, nobody cares, because he's an ordinary guy. Everyone knows who he is. He was the real estate developer. He was the one that changed the New York skyline. He was the one that rebuilt the Central Park ice skating rink in record time when the authorities had failed to do it for years, or almost a decade from memory. He was the one that had the very successful 11 season, was it, series, The Apprentice. Everyone knows who Trump is, and all the Democrat media loved him prior to him running as a Republican in 2015. And of course, the View, the nasty left-wing cows on the View used to run up and hug him when he came on stage. Oh yeah, all that changed because of how partisan they are. So Bezos says, now more than ever, the world needs a credible, trusted, independent voice, and where better for that voice to originate than the capital city of the most important country in the world. When you go down the rabbit holes about the Vatican, the London Financial District and Washington, D.C., and you realise that they operate on different rules to the countries that surround them, and they're controlled by the globalists, and they're really the source of everything that plagues humanity across the world, then yeah, that's not going to lend any credibility to the Washington Post or the media in general. So really, Bezos here is wailing about the death of an organisation that's become so corrupt that it's now irrelevant. And other organisations around the world are doing the exact same things, including our own News Corps here, as I like to call it, because it's a dead man walking, and the disgrace that the Australian Broadcasting Commission, now corporation, became, which of course does not deserve 1 cent of taxpayer funding. But anyway, unusually for the Washington Post, this is a unpaywalled article, so you can flick across there and look at washingtonpost.com/opinions and read this one for yourself.